The rancher's greatest mistake was offering his bed to a giant Apache stranger. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's begin our story. The next morning, Jack woke up to the sound of the wind still howling outside. He had hardly slept the night before, his mind restless as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The giant Apache woman had made no noise during the night, and when he had peeked through the crack in the door to check on her, she had been sitting motionless, as if waiting for something. Jack tried to shake off the unease gnawing at him. It was just a woman in need of shelter. Nothing more. He had done the right thing, offering her a place to rest. But the tension in the air was thick. He couldn't help but wonder what had brought her here. Was she truly just seeking refuge? Or was there something more? He had heard rumors of Apache warriors and their ways, but nothing concrete. Jack had lived alone for years, and with it came an instinct to trust no one, to keep to himself. But this situation was different. The woman had been kind, polite even, but there was something about her that unsettled him. He knew the West could be a cruel place, but Jack never expected it to touch him in such an intimate way. He got out of bed and went to check on her. As he approached the room where she was sleeping, he hesitated. His hand rested on the doorknob for a moment, before he turned it and stepped inside. She was sitting at the edge of the bed, fully dressed, her long hair braided neatly behind her. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, there was no recognition in them, just a deep, unreadable calm. She didn't stand up. She didn't say a word. She just looked at him. "Good morning," Jack said, unsure of what else to say. "Did you sleep well?" The woman nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "Yes," she said simply, her voice deep and steady. There was a power in her words, something that made Jack feel small in comparison. "Thank you for letting me stay," she added. "It was kind of you." Jack nodded, but he didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to such gratitude. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. After a moment, the woman spoke again. "My name is Ayanna," she said, as if revealing her name meant something important. Jack didn't know why, but he felt the need to say his own. "Jack Winters." She nodded once, her gaze not leaving his. "I know," she said. The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that made Jack's stomach tighten. "You know?" Jack repeated, unsure of what she meant. She didn't answer right away, but Jack could see something in her eyes, an understanding, a recognition that he couldn't place. "I'm not here by accident, Jack," she said finally. "I didn't come just for shelter. I came because I need help." Her words hit him like a sudden gust of wind. He didn't know why, but he felt a strange sense of unease. What did she mean by that? "Help with what?" Jack asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Ayanna didn't immediately answer. Instead, she stood up from the bed, her large frame casting a shadow across the room. She was taller than most men Jack had ever known, her broad shoulders strong and powerful. She seemed to fill the space around her, as if she carried a presence too big for any room. She stepped toward Jack, her boots heavy on the wooden floor, and he instinctively took a step back, though he didn't know why. "I am the leader of my tribe," she said, her voice unwavering, "and I need you to protect me." Jack blinked, his heart pounding. "Protect you?" The words didn't make sense. He wasn't a protector. He was just a rancher, a man who had lived alone for years, keeping to himself. "I don't understand," he said, his voice low. "What do you need me for?" Ayanna looked at him with those piercing eyes, and for a moment, Jack thought he saw something flicker in them, something almost like fear, but quickly hidden behind a mask of stoic calm. "There are enemies after me," she said, her voice cold, her gaze unyielding. "And they will stop at nothing to destroy me and my people. I can't fight them alone." Jack felt a wave of confusion and apprehension wash over him. He wasn't a warrior. He didn't have the training or the means to protect anyone, let alone a powerful Apache leader. But something about her, something in the way she spoke, in the calm certainty that radiated from her, made him feel as though he was already involved, already a part of something far bigger than himself. Before he could speak, there was a loud noise from outside the cabin. The sound of hoofs. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he rushed to the window, his hand gripping the frame. Through the dust and morning light, he saw a group of riders approaching fast. And they weren't alone. Behind them, more riders emerged, like a flood of shadow against the horizon. Ayanna stepped up beside him, her eyes narrowing as she looked out over the landscape. "They're here," she said quietly. "And they're not here for me alone." Jack's mind raced. His first instinct was to run, to escape into the wilderness. But he knew, deep down, there was nowhere to run. This was no longer just about a lone rancher and a stranger seeking shelter. It was about something far greater. And it was happening right at his doorstep. The riders were getting closer. Jack could hear their horses pounding the ground, the sound of hooves growing louder with each passing second. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Ayanna's gaze remained fixed on the horizon, her expression unwavering. "They're not here to negotiate," she said softly, almost to herself. Jack turned to look at her, his heart racing. "What do you mean?" He could feel the weight of the situation settling on his chest, pressing down with a force he had never known. "They're here to destroy," she replied, her voice steady. "And they'll stop at nothing to do it." Jack swallowed hard. He wasn't a fighter. He wasn't trained for this kind of violence. He had spent his life working the land, not defending it. But the determination in Ayanna's eyes, the way she stood tall, unflinching in the face of danger, stirred something inside him. Something he hadn't felt in years. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Ayanna's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of something softer in her gaze, perhaps a hint of gratitude or understanding. "We stand our ground," she said, her tone resolute. "You've already made your choice by offering me shelter. Now we fight together." Jack nodded, though he had no idea what he was stepping into. He couldn't let her face this alone. The wind had picked up, swirling dust and dirt through the air, and Jack felt the weight of his own decisions pressing on him. He wasn't sure if he was ready for what was coming, but he knew one thing. There was no turning back now. As the riders neared, Jack could make out their faces, hard, unforgiving, the kind of men who had seen too much of the world's cruelty. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, locked eyes with Jack, his gaze cold and calculating. "You've made a grave mistake, rancher," the man called out, his voice carrying across the distance. Jack stepped forward, trying to steady his breathing. He had to show strength, even if he didn't feel it. "I've done no wrong," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. The scarred man sneered. "You've sheltered the one who will bring ruin to this land. You've sided with the Apache, and for that, you will pay." Jack's mind raced. He didn't know what Ayanna had done to earn the wrath of these men, but he knew that the conflict had reached his doorstep. There was no escaping it. Ayanna stepped forward, her posture regal, her eyes fierce. "I have not come here to bring ruin," she said, her voice strong. "I have come to protect what is mine, to defend my people, and I will not let you stand in my way." The riders shifted, clearly unaccustomed to being spoken to in such a way. The scarred man looked back at his group, as if gauging their reactions. "You've made your choice, Apache," he said coldly. "Now we'll make ours." He gave a signal, and the group began to move, circling Jack's ranch, closing in like a noose around a trapped animal. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the weight of the moment, the inevitability of the coming clash. The sound of hooves grew louder as they moved in closer. And Jack knew the time for words was over. Ayanna turned to Jack, her expression hardening with resolve. "Get inside. Prepare yourself. They will not stop until they've taken what they want." Jack hesitated for a moment, but the urgency in her voice spurred him into action. He turned and sprinted towards the cabin, his thoughts racing. He grabbed his rifle and ammunition, his hands trembling slightly as he loaded the weapon. He wasn't sure what kind of fight he was about to face, but he knew he couldn't back down. He returned to the door, and there stood Ayanna, watching the riders move into position. "They'll try to break us, rancher," she said, her voice steady, almost comforting in its certainty. "But we won't break." Jack nodded, a surge of determination rising within him. He didn't know what would happen next, but he would stand with her. For the first time in years, he felt like he had something to fight for. As the first rider rode towards the door, Jack gripped his rifle, ready to face whatever came next. The battle was upon them, and there was no turning back. The riders had closed in, their movements synchronized like a well-oiled machine. The sound of hooves pounding the earth was deafening as they surrounded Jack's ranch. The tension was palpable, hanging thick in the air like a storm ready to break. Jack stood next to Ayanna, his rifle in hand, feeling his pulse race with each passing second. He had never imagined his life would come to this, a quiet rancher caught in the middle of a deadly conflict. But here he was, and there was no going back now. Ayanna's presence beside him was unwavering. She moved with the grace and confidence of a warrior, her eyes scanning the riders as they encircled the property. Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. She was nothing like the other women he had known. Strong, powerful, yet there was a calmness in her that made him believe they might actually stand a chance. "Stay close," Ayanna whispered, her voice steady. "They will try to provoke you. Don't give them the satisfaction." Jack nodded, his grip tightening around his rifle. He had no intention of backing down, but the fear was there, deep in the pit of his stomach. The riders dismounted, forming a circle around the ranch. The leader, the man with the scar running down his cheek, stepped forward, his eyes locking with Jack's. "You've made a grave mistake, rancher," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Sheltering a traitor, siding with the Apache will cost you more than you can imagine." Jack stood his ground, trying to suppress the fear that threatened to overtake him. "I didn't know she was your enemy," Jack said, his voice calm but firm. "I just offered her shelter. She's just a woman, not some criminal." The scarred man sneered. "A woman who's led countless raids on settlers, taken lives, and burned entire villages. And now, you want to protect her? You've made your bed, rancher, and now you'll lie in it." Jack's mind raced. He didn't know what Ayanna had done, but he didn't care. She had asked for his help, and he had given it. He wouldn't turn his back on her now. The scarred man's eyes narrowed, a twisted smile crossing his face. "You'll regret this," he said. "We'll make sure of it." With a swift motion, the scarred man raised his hand, signaling to the rest of the riders. The circle tightened, and Jack's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the moment of truth. Ayanna stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You don't know what you're dealing with," she said, her tone fierce and commanding. "I am not some helpless woman you can intimidate. If you think you can take me down, you're sorely mistaken." The scarred man took a step back, clearly taken aback by her confidence. "You're a fool, Apache," he spat. "You're nothing but a savage, and your people will fall." But Ayanna didn't flinch. She stood tall, unwavering in the face of the threat. "You think you can destroy my people, my tribe?" she said, her voice growing stronger. "You'll have to go through me first." The riders exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to respond. The tension in the air was electric, and Jack could feel it, too. He wasn't sure how this would end, but he knew one thing. He couldn't just stand by and do nothing. As the leader of the riders stepped forward again, a look of anger in his eyes, Ayanna made her move. She raised her hand, signaling for Jack to follow her lead. Without a word, Jack stepped forward, rifle raised. The scarred man froze for a moment, his eyes widening in shock. It was clear they hadn't expected the rancher to stand his ground. "You'll regret this," the man muttered, but his voice lacked the conviction it had earlier. Ayanna didn't respond. She simply nodded to Jack, and together they moved. With one fluid motion, Ayanna sprang into action, her speed and strength taking the riders by surprise. She was a force to be reckoned with, a whirlwind of power and precision. Jack followed suit, his rifle aimed carefully, his hands steady despite the adrenaline rushing through his veins. The riders began to scatter, realizing they were outmatched. The scarred man cursed under his breath, but it was too late. Ayanna and Jack had turned the tide. As the last of the riders fled, the sound of their hooves fading into the distance, Jack stood there, panting, his heart still racing. He looked over at Ayanna, who was wiping the sweat from her brow. She had saved them both. "You were right," Jack said, his voice full of awe. "You are a warrior." Ayanna gave him a small smile, but her eyes were still sharp. "This isn't over," she said, her voice steady. "They'll be back. And next time, we'll be ready." Jack nodded, his mind racing. The battle may have been won, but the war was far from over. And now, he had no choice but to stand with Ayanna, no matter the cost. The days following the attack were tense, and Jack found it hard to shake the sense of unease that lingered in the air. The riders had retreated for now, but Ayanna's words echoed in his mind. "They will be back." Jack spent most of his time preparing for whatever might come next. The ranch had always been his sanctuary, a place of solitude where he could forget the world. But now, everything had changed. Ayanna stayed close, her presence constant and unwavering. But Jack could see the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. She was not just a woman seeking refuge anymore. She was a leader, a protector, and a symbol of strength. Jack couldn't help but admire her, but he also knew that the challenges ahead would test both of them in ways they hadn't imagined. On the fourth day after the attack, as Jack worked in the barn, he heard the unmistakable sound of hooves once more. His heart sank. He rushed to the door, rifle in hand, his mind racing. But this time, it wasn't the riders from before. The group approaching was smaller, more deliberate, and their movements were not as threatening. Jack's eyes narrowed as they came closer, recognizing one of the men immediately, the scarred leader from the first encounter. He had returned. But this time, it seemed there was something different about him. The man raised his hand in a gesture of peace as he rode up to the ranch. "I've come to talk," he called out, his voice less harsh than before. Jack hesitated. He didn't trust these men, not after what had happened, but Ayanna's voice echoed in his mind. Never judge a man by his past. Reluctantly, he lowered his rifle and stepped forward. "What do you want?" Jack called, keeping his voice steady. The scarred man dismounted slowly, his eyes studying Jack carefully. "I came to offer you a choice," he said. "The Apache woman you shelter. She is a threat to us all. We've come to stop her, and we will not stop until she's gone." Jack's heart raced, but he held his ground. "I don't want trouble," Jack said. "I offered her shelter, nothing more." The man's eyes hardened. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low and cold. "This is bigger than you. This is about survival. You can keep her here, but it will cost you." Jack's pulse quickened. He had heard enough of this man's threats. "I won't turn her away," Jack said, his voice firm. The scarred man didn't flinch. "Then you will pay the price," he said, turning to leave. "We'll be back. And next time, you won't have the luxury of choosing." With that, he turned and rode off, his men following closely behind. Jack stood there for a long moment, his rifle still in his hands, his mind racing. What had just happened? Had the man really come to offer him a choice? Or was this just another threat in a long line of them? He didn't know, but one thing was clear: Ayanna was right. They would be back. And when they did, Jack would have to decide once and for all what kind of man he was going to be. Later that evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Jack found Ayanna sitting on the porch, looking out over the land. He walked up beside her, his footsteps soft on the dirt. "They're coming back," Jack said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of the words. Ayanna turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. "I know," she said simply. Jack sat down beside her, the silence stretching between them. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ayanna didn't answer immediately. Instead, she gazed out at the horizon, her mind clearly elsewhere. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost too calm. "We prepare," she said. "There's nothing else we can do." Jack nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that hung in the air. He didn't know what kind of fight was coming, but he knew it would change everything. And this time, there would be no turning back. The next morning, Jack woke up early, the first rays of sunlight peeking over the ridge. The ranch was quiet, as it always was in the early hours of the day. But the silence felt different today. It felt heavy, like a storm was brewing on the horizon. Jack went about his work, but his mind kept returning to Ayanna, to the words she had said. "We prepare." He didn't know how to prepare for what was coming, but he knew he had to try. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. The air was thick with anticipation, and he knew that the moment of truth was drawing near. They would come for Ayanna, and when they did, Jack would have to make his choice. He wasn't sure what that choice would be, but he knew it would be the hardest decision of his life. The days that followed were filled with preparation and anticipation. Jack worked tirelessly around the ranch, checking the fences, making sure the cattle were secure, and trying to push aside the growing unease that gnawed at him. Ayanna had been quiet, but Jack could sense the weight of the situation bearing down on her. She was a warrior, a leader, but she was also alone in a strange land now, and Jack knew that she was relying on him. He had never thought of himself as a man of action, but now, with the threat of violence looming closer, he knew he couldn't stand by and watch. The morning of the 7th day after the riders had left, Jack woke early to the sound of hooves again. His heart skipped a beat. He knew that the time had come. He grabbed his rifle and rushed outside, his eyes scanning the horizon. In the distance, he could make out a small group of riders, not the large band that had come before, but enough to make him feel the tension in his chest. He stood firm, his breath steadying as he waited for them to come closer. Ayanna stepped beside him, her hand resting on the hilt of her own weapon. Her eyes were fixed on the riders as they drew near. "They've returned," Jack said, his voice low but steady. Ayanna nodded, her face impassive. "It's time," she said, her voice calm, though Jack could hear the underlying urgency in it. The riders approached slowly, keeping their distance as they reached the edge of the ranch. The leader, the scarred man, stepped forward once again, his eyes cold and calculating. "You've made your decision," he said, his voice carrying across the open space. "And now, we will make ours." Jack stood tall, his rifle held steady, his eyes locked on the leader. "I won't back down," he said firmly. "This land is mine, and I'll defend it." The scarred man smirked, a look of amusement crossing his face. "Defend it," he scoffed. "Against us? You're just a rancher, a man of the land. You can't stop what's coming." Ayanna stepped forward, her presence powerful, her gaze unwavering. "You're wrong," she said, her voice strong. "I'm not just a woman. I'm the one who will stop you." The leader's expression faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. He nodded to his men, signaling them to dismount. "We'll see how long your courage lasts when the battle comes," he said coldly. "We'll see who stands and who falls." As the riders dismounted, the tension in the air became almost unbearable. Jack could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. His hands clenched around his rifle, his breath steadying as he prepared for what was about to come. Ayanna was right beside him, her stance ready, her eyes scanning the riders. The scarred man gestured to his men, and suddenly, they began to advance. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't move. He wouldn't back down. This was his home, and he would fight for it. The first rider lunged forward, but before he could take another step, Ayanna moved. She was a blur of motion, faster than Jack had ever seen anyone move, her blade flashing in the morning sun. She struck with precision, taking the rider off guard and sending him to the ground with a grunt of pain. The other riders hesitated for a moment, their eyes wide with surprise. But that hesitation was all Jack needed. He raised his rifle, aiming carefully. He fired once, the shot ringing out across the ranch, and the rider closest to him fell, his horse rearing up in fear. The remaining riders reacted quickly, but Jack was already moving. He and Ayanna worked in sync, their movements fluid and coordinated, as if they had fought side by side for years. They were a force to be reckoned with, and the riders quickly realized that they had underestimated the rancher. The battle was swift but fierce. Jack moved with a sense of purpose, his rifle firing accurately, his body reacting instinctively. Ayanna, meanwhile, was a whirlwind, cutting down anyone who came too close, her strength and speed unmatched. The scarred man watched from the edge of the fight, his expression a mix of frustration and disbelief. He had thought that they could overwhelm the rancher and his ally, but he had not counted on the ferocity with which they fought back. One by one, the riders fell, either retreating or collapsing under the relentless assault. Finally, the scarred man was the last one standing. He raised his hand, signaling for his men to stop. "Enough," he shouted, his voice filled with rage. "This isn't over." He glared at Jack and Ayanna, his eyes burning with hatred. "You may have won today, but we will be back. And next time, you won't stand a chance." With that, he turned and signaled for the remaining riders to retreat. As they rode off into the distance, Jack lowered his rifle, his chest heaving with exertion. He looked over at Ayanna, who was breathing heavily but standing tall. "We did it," Jack said, his voice filled with awe. Ayanna gave him a small, tired smile. "This battle is won," she said, her voice steady. "But the war is far from over." Jack nodded, his heart still racing. He had stood his ground, and together with Ayanna, they had fought off the riders. But Ayanna was right. This was just the beginning. The true test was still ahead. The days that followed the battle felt like a temporary reprieve. Jack and Ayanna returned to their routines, though the unease never fully left. The scarred man and his riders had retreated, but both knew they would be back. It was only a matter of time. Jack spent long hours repairing the damage done during the skirmish, fixing fences, and ensuring his cattle were secure. Ayanna, too, kept busy, her vigilance unyielding. She knew the enemy would regroup, and she needed to be prepared. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the land, Jack sat on the porch, his rifle resting on his knee. He watched as Ayanna worked near the barn, her movements purposeful, her focus unwavering. Jack had learned much about her since her arrival. She was a woman of strength, but also of great responsibility. She carried the weight of her people on her shoulders, and it was clear she would do whatever it took to protect them. But Jack couldn't help but wonder, how much longer could they keep this up? The constant tension, the fear of another attack, it was taking its toll. He was no warrior, no leader. He was just a rancher, and yet, he found himself entangled in a battle that was much bigger than anything he had ever imagined. Ayanna approached him, her expression unreadable. She sat down beside him without a word, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken thoughts. "They'll come again," Ayanna said finally, breaking the quiet. Jack nodded. "I know," he replied. "But we can't keep living like this. We can't keep waiting for them to show up." Ayanna turned to look at him, her eyes fierce but filled with a weariness Jack hadn't seen before. "What do you suggest?" she asked. Jack thought for a moment, then spoke, his voice steady. "I say we take the fight to them. We don't wait for them to come to us. We go after them, before they can hurt anyone else." Ayanna's expression softened, but only for a moment. "You would risk everything? For me?" Jack didn't hesitate. "For you. For us," he said firmly. "This isn't just about protecting my land anymore. It's about protecting what's right." Ayanna studied him for a moment, her gaze unwavering. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Then we prepare," she said. "We gather what we need, and we strike first." The plan was set into motion quickly. Ayanna and Jack spent the next few days gathering supplies, preparing their weapons, and strategizing. Ayanna had a few allies scattered across the region, tribal warriors who had fought alongside her before. She sent word to them, requesting their help in taking down the enemy once and for all. It wasn't an easy decision for her, but Ayanna knew this was the only way to ensure the safety of her people. Jack, too, had his role to play. He wasn't just fighting for his ranch anymore. He was fighting for something bigger. The morning of the attack arrived, and the tension in the air was thicker than ever. Jack and Ayanna rode out with a small group of warriors at their backs. Jack had never felt more alive, and yet more terrified, in his life. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for justice. The landscape stretched before them, the hills and valleys bathed in the soft light of dawn. It was eerily quiet, the calm before the storm. As they neared the enemy's camp, Ayanna motioned for them to dismount. They would approach on foot, the element of surprise on their side. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as they moved through the underbrush, each step bringing them closer to the enemy. He had never felt this kind of pressure, never known what it was like to fight for something so important. But as they neared the camp, Jack felt a sense of clarity. He wasn't just fighting to protect his land anymore. He was fighting for what was right. They reached the camp without being noticed. The riders were still asleep, their campfires dimming in the early light. Ayanna signaled to her warriors, and they moved quickly, silently, into position. Jack took a deep breath and followed her lead. It was time. The battle that followed was swift and brutal. Jack had never been in a fight like this before. The sound of weapons clashing, the cries of battle, the heat of the moment, it was all overwhelming. But through it all, Ayanna was a force to be reckoned with. She moved with a precision and strength that left Jack in awe. The enemy was caught off guard, and it didn't take long before they began to retreat. Jack fired his rifle, his hands steady despite the chaos around him. He felt a surge of pride as he saw the riders fall back, their spirits broken by the unexpected attack. Ayanna's warriors moved quickly, cutting down anyone who dared to stand in their way. And in the midst of the chaos, Jack knew that this was it, the turning point. The scarred leader, the one who had threatened them before, was among those retreating. Jack's eyes locked onto him, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. He knew that this was the man who had started it all, the man who had threatened everything Jack had worked for. Without thinking, Jack raised his rifle and took aim. The shot rang out, and the scarred man fell, his body crumpling to the ground. The rest of the riders scattered, knowing that their leader was gone. Ayanna walked over to Jack, her expression unreadable. She looked down at the fallen leader, then back at Jack. "It's over," she said quietly. Jack nodded, his chest heaving with exhaustion and relief. For the first time in days, he felt like he could finally breathe. But Ayanna's words lingered in his mind. This is just the beginning. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. Jack knew that, but for now, he allowed himself a moment of peace. The fight was theirs to win, and together, they would stand strong. The battle had been won, but the aftermath weighed heavily on Jack. The ground was littered with the remains of the fallen, and the silence that followed the chaos felt almost suffocating. Jack stood with Ayanna, his rifle still in hand, but his body aching from the adrenaline-fueled fight. The dust of the battlefield hung in the air like a cloud, the once pristine land now marred by the signs of conflict. As the last of the retreating riders disappeared over the horizon, Jack let out a slow breath, the tension in his shoulders releasing just a bit. "We did it," Jack said, his voice low and rough. Ayanna turned to him, her face serious, but there was a faint hint of respect in her eyes. "For now," she replied. "But they will come again. This isn't over." Jack nodded, knowing that she was right. The fight had been fierce, but the enemy wasn't defeated. They had simply been pushed back. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Ayanna walked to the edge of the battlefield, her gaze fixed on the distance. Jack followed her, unsure of what to say. There was a calmness in her, a strength that Jack admired, but he also sensed the weight she carried. She wasn't just fighting for her people anymore. She was fighting for them all. "How long will they keep coming for you?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ayanna turned to him, her expression unreadable. "As long as I stand, they will fight," she said. "But it is not just me they seek. It is everything I represent, my people, my land, my way of life. They will never stop." Jack looked out at the field, the bodies of the fallen scattered around them. "I didn't know what I was getting into when I offered you shelter," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "I didn't realize what it would cost." Ayanna walked over to him, her steps silent on the ground. "You didn't know," she said softly. "But now you do." Jack met her gaze, and for the first time, he saw something deeper in her eyes. It was a recognition of shared struggle, of a bond that had been forged in the heat of battle. "What happens now?" Jack asked, the question hanging in the air between them. Ayanna paused for a moment, considering her words. "We rebuild," she said. "We rest for now, but the fight isn't over. We must prepare for the next wave." Jack looked at her, a sense of resolve forming within him. "I'll stand with you," he said firmly, "for as long as it takes." Ayanna gave him a small nod, acknowledging the commitment. "I never expected you to, but I'm glad you chose to," she said. "Your strength will be needed." As night fell over the ranch, Jack and Ayanna worked together to bury the fallen. It was a somber task, one that required silence more than anything else. The dead had been left on the battlefield, their lives taken in the name of a conflict that seemed endless. Jack found himself reflecting on what he had become, a man who had once lived alone, far removed from the struggles of the world, now standing alongside a woman whose people had been forced into a war they never wanted. He had chosen to fight, to protect something larger than himself. The next few days were filled with preparation. Ayanna trained Jack, showing him how to fight in ways he never thought possible. It was grueling, exhausting work, but Jack pushed through, knowing that it was the only way to ensure their survival. The threat was still out there, and the enemies they had defeated today would be back, stronger and more determined than ever. They weren't fighting just for survival anymore. They were fighting for their future. As Jack trained, he saw the determination in Ayanna's eyes, the same fire that had driven her through the battle. She was a leader, and he was starting to understand what that meant. It wasn't just about strength, it was about resilience, about never giving up, no matter the cost. Jack felt that same resolve growing inside him. He wasn't just a rancher anymore. He was part of something bigger. He was part of a fight that would shape the future of the land they both loved. But as the days passed and the preparations continued, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still to come. The enemies they had defeated were just the beginning. The battle for survival was far from over, and Jack knew that. In the end, They would all have to make sacrifices to protect what mattered most. But for now, all he could do was stand with Iona and wait. The storm was coming, but they were ready. Together, they would face whatever came their way. The morning of the final confrontation arrived, and the air was thick with tension. Jack could feel it in his bones, the weight of the coming storm pressing down on him. He stood at the edge of the ranch, looking out over the land, the place he had fought so hard to protect. Beside him, Iona stood tall, her face as resolute as ever. The warriors she had called for had arrived the previous day, and they were ready. Jack wasn't a soldier, wasn't a warrior, but he was here, standing with Iona, ready to face whatever came their way. The riders had been quiet for too long. Jack knew they would come, and this time, they would come in full force. They had pushed Jack and Iona to the edge, but today, they would stand firm. There was no more running, no more hiding. The time for fighting had arrived. The horizon began to darken, the wind picking up as the first signs of an incoming storm made themselves known. It was a storm that had been brewing for years, and now, it was about to break. As the first signs of movement appeared in the distance, Jack's grip tightened on his rifle. He stood tall, not because he was brave, but because he knew this was the only choice he had. Iona's warriors had taken their positions, their faces set in stone. They were ready for the battle that was about to unfold, a battle that would decide the fate of the ranch, of the land, and of the future they had all fought for. "They're coming," Iona said quietly, her voice low but steady. "We stand together, no matter what." Jack nodded, his breath steady, but his heart racing. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew he couldn't turn back. "Together," he echoed, his voice strong despite the fear gnawing at him. The riders appeared at the edge of the ranch, their silhouettes dark against the sky. They were coming in full force, just as Iona had predicted. The scarred leader rode at the front, his eyes cold and full of hatred. "This is the end for you, Apache," he called out, his voice carrying across the field. Iona didn't flinch. She stood tall, her eyes fixed on him, unwavering. "This is the end for you," she replied, her voice as sharp as a blade. The leader sneered, his men following his lead. "You should have surrendered when you had the chance," he said. "Now, you'll pay for your defiance." Iona stepped forward, her warriors moving with her. Jack took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. He didn't know if they would win, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't backing down. The battle erupted almost immediately. The riders charged, their horses thundering across the land, but Iona's warriors were ready. They met the charge head-on, their weapons flashing in the sunlight, their movements swift and deadly. Jack fought alongside them, his rifle firing in quick succession. He had never been in a battle like this before, but there was something inside him now, a sense of purpose, a sense of duty. He fought for the land, for Iona, for everything he had come to care about. The clash of weapons, the cries of battle, the thundering of hooves, it all blended into a chaotic symphony. But Jack kept his focus, his eyes trained on the enemy. The scarred leader was among them, cutting through Iona's warriors with ruthless precision. Jack saw him push through the line, heading straight for Iona. A surge of adrenaline shot through him. He couldn't let the leader get to her. Jack moved with the speed he hadn't known he possessed, closing the distance between him and the scarred man. The two locked eyes for a brief moment before Jack raised his rifle and fired. The shot rang out, and the scarred man staggered, falling to the ground with a thud. His men hesitated, their morale shattered by the fall of their leader. Iona's warriors pressed forward, driving them back. It didn't take long for the remaining riders to retreat, scattering into the distance like broken shadows. The battle was over. Iona stood over the fallen leader, her face cold, her expression unreadable. Jack approached her slowly, his chest still heaving with the exertion of the fight. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Iona looked at him, her gaze softening for the first time since the battle began. "For now," she said quietly. "But there will always be more to fight for." Jack nodded, understanding what she meant. This fight had been won, but the war was far from over. The land they fought for, the future they hoped to build, would always be under threat. But for now, they had survived. They had fought together, and they had won. Jack looked out over the land, feeling a sense of peace wash over him for the first time in a long while. It was hard-earned, but it was theirs. Together, they would stand, no matter what came next.